The Spanish Civil War is rarely used as a lens to understand the post-war era. Remembered as a decisive prelude to World War II, the battle between the Republican revolutionaries and the Francoist nationalists would seem to have little heuristic value for subsequent Cold War rivalries and anti-colonial struggles. Perhaps this is due to its complicated legacy. Despite assistance from Hitler and Mussolini, Franco's regime ended up being drafted into the ranks of the anti-totalitarian camp. On the other side of the Iron Curtain, the veterans of the international brigades were among the first victims of Stalinist purges. This complicated legacy is evident in Latin America as well. The succession of revolutions, coups, democratic experiments, and military dictatorships that shook the subcontinent during the Cold War are mostly interpreted as expressions of and challenges to U.S. dominance. Nevertheless, for the Canadian historian Kirsten Weld, the Spanish Civil War has never ceased to be a defining point of reference in the imaginary of Latin American political actors. On both the left and the right, the tragic fate of the Spanish Republic provided inspiration, less as a milestone in European history and more as a model for the ongoing battles between Latin American progressives and conservatives. In her recent articles and forthcoming book, Ruins and Glory, Weld reveals the hidden histories of what she calls the long Spanish Civil War in Latin America. The origin of this project, Weld explains in her interview with us, was an archival discovery, a private conversation between Augusto Pinochet and Henry Kissinger in 1976. To give the American Secretary of State a clearer idea of his own agenda, the Chilean dictator explained that his struggle was the same as Franco's had been 40 years earlier. Soon after making this discovery, Weld found that reactionary rulers were not the only ones to use the Spanish Civil War as their compass. At the other end of the political spectrum, the Nicaraguan intellectual Sergio Ramirez wrote in his memoir about the Sandinista Revolution of 1979 that he and his comrades had inherited the lost dreams of the Spanish Republic, passed down through generations. Once you start looking for them, Weld told us, references to the Spanish Civil War appear everywhere. From the writings of Pablo Neruda, Gabriel Garcia Marquez, and Roberto Bolaño, to the childhood memories of Fidel Castro and Che Guevara, both of whom were trained in guerrilla warfare by Spanish exiles. Other such references can be found in the alarmed sermons of conservative bishops and the rants of reactionary ideologues. More than a memorable episode, the conflict between the Spanish Republic and its phalangist foes formed a rich and complex object lesson for both the left and the right. To Latin American conservatives, Franco's Spain represented a uniquely attractive blend of Catholic anti-communism and anti-liberal racialism. The Generalissimo had not only reasserted the colonial privileges of Hispanidad, to which the Latin American ruling elites claimed to belong. He had also revived the imaginary of the medieval Reconquista. Communists, according to this vision, were not just political adversaries, but an invasive race of aliens who carried what the Spanish psychiatrist Antonio Vallejo Nájera called a red gene. The endgame was not merely to ward off socialist revolutions or the election of Popular Front governments, but also to turn back the clock to an early modern and decidedly pre-democratic social order. For their part, Latin American progressives pondered the lessons that needed to be drawn from the fall of the Spanish Republic. Had its elected leaders been too timid or too radical in their anti-fascist struggle? What part did the fractiousness of their own coalition play in their eventual demise? And what were the chances of achieving democratic reforms in post-war Latin America? After all, Western leaders of the so-called free world had no qualms about making Franco's Spain a member of the UN. What's more, they were now sponsoring the coups of its admirers in the subcontinent. The democratic transitions that accompanied or followed the end of the Cold War did not diminish the symbolic importance of the Spanish Civil War in Latin America. On the left, the anti-colonial dimension of the social movements that would eventually bring about the pink tides of the 2000s attests to what they were up against: a post-colonial order predicated on the Hispanic supremacy championed by Franco's followers. On the right, the old phalangist contention that liberal democracy was not the antithesis of communism, but the gateway to it, goes a long way in explaining the rise of postmodern caudillos, from Jair Bolsonaro in Brazil and Nayib Bukele in El Salvador, to Javier Milei in Argentina and José Antonio Cast in Chile. As illiberal or neo-fascist regimes proliferate and endeavor to criminalize all forms of anti-fascist resistance, it has become commonplace to evoke a return of the 1930s. Yet, as Kirsten Weld demonstrates, what we are witnessing, in and beyond Latin America, is less a resurgence of supposedly discarded ideologies after decades of dormancy than the surfacing and morphing of intellectual and political currents that never disappeared. The enduring imprint of the Spanish Civil War in Latin America is exemplary in this regard. Our interview took place in New York on March 19, 2026.
In your recent articles and your forthcoming book, you explore the impact in the afterlife of the Spanish Civil War in Latin America, both from the point of view of far-right actors inspired by Francoism and from the point of view of left actors, progressives, revolutionaries inspired by the Spanish Republic. Could you begin by telling us about how your project came about, how, when, and why you started working on the Spanish Civil War and reckoning with its impact in Latin America?
Yeah, so it was an accident, and it came about as I was preparing for teaching. So one of the classes that I teach is a survey history of Latin America from independence, the early 19th century, to the present. And I was looking around for new translated primary sources that I could assign to my students. And just by happenstance, I read in the same week 2 very different documents that, had I read them a year apart from each other, I might not have connected them. But because I just happened to read them in the same week, it was this sort of serendipitous thing. The first document was the declassified transcript of a conversation between Henry Kissinger and Augusto Pinochet in 1976. Kissinger was in Chile for an OAS meeting, and they had a kind of private conversation. And in that conversation, Kissinger is saying, you know, I love Chile. What a great country, such nice people. And Pinochet says, yes, this is a warm-hearted country of people who love liberty. But, you know, it's interesting because this thing that's happening and that's been happening in my country is a further stage of the same conflict that was born in the Spanish Civil War. And I'm going to bring it to an end, basically. And I was reading this and I thought, that's funny. It's funny that Pinochet is sitting in Santiago de Chile in 1976, talking to Kissinger about the Spanish Civil War. Why would he do this? Why not talk about the Cuban Revolution or Vietnam or something that's sort of more germane to that moment? So I kind of noticed that and set it aside in my head. And then a couple of days later, I was reading the memoirs of Sergio Ramirez, who is a Nicaraguan intellectual and poet who was part of the civilian revolutionary directorate that ran the Sandinista government in the years after the triumph of the Sandinista revolution in 1979. And so in his memoirs, which had just been translated into English by Duke University Press, he's talking at the beginning about sort of why did we fight? Why did people in Nicaragua sort of, how did we acquire the temerity to imagine that we could overthrow the dynastic Somoza dictatorship that had kept our people in chains for 40 years with the support of the United States? And so he's talking about the sort of different inputs into the revolutionary struggle in Nicaragua. He's saying, of course we were fighting against Yankee imperialism and the way that the United States had throttled all of our legitimate demands for, democratic opening and social change. We also thought of ourselves as part of the global left of the 1960s. We also, were inspired by the ongoing movements for decolonization in Africa and Asia. We were, of course, mindful of the crushing of Allende's democratic project in Chile in 1973. And further back, we carried with us the broken hope, la esperanza rota, of the Spanish Republic. And I thought, that's weird that a Nicaraguan intellectual reflecting in the 90s on a social movement that he had been a part of in the 1960s and 1970s would reach back to the Spanish Republic as a kind of point of inspiration for the struggle that he became such a key part of. And so it was because I had read these two very different texts in the same week by these two different figures who were so important and kind of indexical of the far right political imaginary in the height of the Cold War and the kind of radical left political imaginary in the height of the Cold War, culminating in the Sandinista Revolution. Why is it? How could it be that they both immediately pull to the Spanish Civil War when trying to account for what it is that they think they're doing, what their political horizon is? And so it was really from that quite serendipitous little experience of encountering these texts at the same time that I started looking for mentions of references to Spain and the Spanish Civil War in this much later period in the Latin American context, and just started finding them everywhere. And that is true in disparate theaters of, whether we're talking about musicians, poets, the history of sports, like all kinds of bizarre little places where mentions of whether it's Spanish exiles or more commonly just this idea of what people thought the Spanish Civil War was, and that having informed how they thought about who they themselves were and what kinds of projects that they were working on, how frequently I started coming across these different mentions. And so really the project that became this book that I'm finishing now began as me just trying to aggregate and combine and put together all of these different little references and mentions and see what they added up to. And what I think they add up to is something that tells us that helps us explain quite a bit of the intensity, the ferocity of the cycles of revolutionary and counter-revolutionary political violence that defined Latin America's history in the second half of the 20th century, and the legacies of which continue to this day. And in trying to think with and about how to frame that, I found really helpful the writing of Kristen Ross on the sort of afterlives of the Paris Commune and the structuring effects of the Commune on French social and political imaginations sort of ever after, in which she talks about the idea of the survie of the Commune, right? That it's not so simple as saying, okay, there was a historical event and then I have these afterlives that are sort of separate from it. That instead, by thinking about the survie of the Commune, we have to kind of consider those afterlives or legacies or subsequent invocations as actually part and parcel of the original event itself, as originating from its elemental logic. And so I started to come to see what in Spanish you would call the supervivencia of the Spanish Civil War in Latin America, kind of in a similar way. I found Ross a very helpful sort of roadmap in that respect for seeing the ways in which the Spanish Civil War played out contemporaneously in Latin America, but then more importantly, I think the ways in which it's been invoked and played with and looked to in the aftermath as actually emanating from the logics of the Spanish Civil War itself in ways that have not gotten a lot of attention because most folks who think about the Spanish Civil War are thinking about Europe. They're not thinking about the Americas. And so if you think about the Americas, you kind of see a bit of a different story. So that's how it all got going.
So yes, so your project certainly talks about the importance of the lens of the Spanish Civil War in the history of South America, both before, during, and after the Cold War. But I would claim that it does not only do that it has a particular heuristic value for our post-Cold War era. I mean, one that could start around 2015, 2016. And our claim would be that it has a particular heuristic value for two reasons. One is that there are three striking similarities, which would be the fact that there is a remarkable solidarity despite differences in what could be called the reactionary international, sort of the neo-fascist of today. That there is a growing propensity from centrists of all stripes to sort of accept the fact that, well, maybe the time has come to make an alliance with the far right. And the problems of the left, not only to resist, but to know how to resist and to wonder what to do about liberals in this form of resistance. These things seem very present, very current, but at the same time quite reminiscent of the 30s, and in particular in the context of the Spanish Civil War. So that is one way in which I think it's crucial heuristically. And another one would be that as you show, it your book, or at least the lens that you choose, displaces a vision of the Cold War based on an East-West, Washington-Moscow divide, but it also complicates what would be the major framing of the second part of the Cold War, which would be more a North-South divide in a way, by sort of reviving something that seems to be very much in a moment of revival, both on the far right and on the left, which would be a fascist versus anti-fascist lens. So now that I've totally preempted your answer to my question, how did you frame your project vis-a-vis our current situation?
Well, to rewind to the beginning of the question, I mean, I think I would push back a little bit on the post-Cold War periodization. I mean, I think that particularly when we are looking at and trying to understand the internal dynamics in parts of the world that are not the United States and the Soviet Union, that the periodization of the Cold War, I think, produces, or at least sort of facilitates, interpretive confusion. And so one of the things that for me has been really important in thinking about the Spanish Civil War in Latin America in the 1930s is that, like, 1945 is not, and the end of the Second World War means something quite different in a Latin American context than it does in a European one, right? And so maybe if we don't actually see 1945 as this caesura, right, the sort of definitive break, that there was a before and there was an after, then that makes it, I think, more possible for us to see important lines of continuity and persistence across these sort of artificial barriers. And so in the same way where I think one of the things I'm trying to do in the book is kind of argue against, for this one part of the world, the idea that 1945 is a watershed because of, there are other reasons you can make a case for 1945 being important in Latin America, but it's not really the end of the Second World War, actually. That logic then has to hold on the other end, that actually perhaps 1989/1991 is not, that neither is that a good bookend for the other end of this period of historical change and conflict that folks in the Latin America space sometimes will call the century of revolution, that began in 1910 with the Mexican Revolution and concludes in 1990 with the defeat of the Sandinista Revolution. That's a different historicity than thinking about the Cold War as the kind of primary temporality that we want to apply to this history. So I don't know that the post-Cold War, I'm not quite sure what to do with that, but maybe you can tell me more in a minute. Nevertheless, obviously, I think, in this kind of moment that we're in of global far-right resurgence, there has been enormous amount of debate about the sort of value of the 1930s for understanding our present, right? This is the fascism debates, quote unquote. This is a lot of kind of nominative disputation over whether or not Trumpism is fascism light, is it fascistoid, is it, at the end of the day, I think that I don't personally have a huge stake in that current of disputation. I'm just more interested in, honestly, like the thing that I'm most interested in actually across all of the work that I've done is like, how do people think of themselves in historical time? How do people situate themselves as part of lineages, as part of practices, traditions, whether they be practices of resistance or traditions of order and maintenance and status quo? Like, how do people use what they think the past was in order to organize their political commitments and their political projects in the present? And so, a thing that is very striking to me about this moment of far-right resurgence that does very clearly track onto the Spanish right in the 1930s and the kind of ideological bases of what becomes the Franco regime is this sort of, resurgent Christian nationalism that very openly harkens back to the Reconquest, to the Crusades, to the, triumph of the Christian kingdoms of central Spain over the Muslim caliphate of Al-Andalus and the final expulsion of Muslims and Jews from Spain in 1492, and this sort of revival of the mythology of Christopher Columbus. This is something that we see both in the kind of Trump universe in the United States, but also very much, one of the first October 12th, which is the anniversary of Columbus accidentally washing up in the Bahamas, the first October 12th in which Milei was president, he put out this just like truly hilarious, kind of AI slop video, basically imagining himself aboard the Santa Maria as it's sailing across the Atlantic Ocean to discover and bring God and civilization to the barbaric, heathen new world or whatever. And that kind of projective, affective identification with the forces of Christian conquest is something that was essential to Franco's consolidation of power in Spain. It is something that we see certainly all over the contemporary Spanish-speaking right, whether that is the sort of Vox universe in Spain itself, or its Latin American homologues in the persons of Milei, Bukele, folks like that, Cast in Chile. But we also see it in like the tattoos on Pete Hegseth, which quite explicitly say we are going to do a new Christian crusades all over the world in order to destroy the infidels. And that is a way of situating oneself in historical time and of recruiting a certain vision of the past in order to serve the needs of the present that I think is extremely dangerous, but has proven itself to have a lot of staying power. And so, I can't relate to why that, I can't personally relate to why that feels like a unifying and winning right-wing discourse, but I think it quite plainly is. It is getting the forces of reaction somewhere. It is serving as glue to hold together coalitions of folks who actually have quite disparate opinions on things like, should there be a confessional state in the United States? What should be the role of, Christian practice in the organizational and institutional frameworks of governance, stuff like that. And so that's one parallel, I guess. Let me return to the sort of the three pieces that you enumerated in your question, because I think that's sort of the first one, right? Like, what are the bases that the reactionary international can cohere around, in addition to the most fundamental and obvious thing, which is just their material interests, right? And I do think that this kind of particular Christian eschatology is one of the elements there that is important for us to understand, and which doesn't have an analog on the left, actually. Then there's the question of the centrists and the liberals, and why do, is it true, in fact, could we extrapolate from the case of Spain and say that liberals will reflexively always make common cause with the far left, with the far right when presented with a threat from what they perceive to be a threat from the left? And I think that that's certainly true at the level of, politicians, sort of bourgeois fractions. They have a common set of interests in the maintenance of order, in the preservation of norms, et cetera. But I think, this is a little bit more complicated if we think about the present moment. For example, here in the United States, where I think that there are tons of everyday people who live in the United States who either don't think of themselves as political at all, or else would think of themselves as kind of, centrists who believe in a kind of, sort of minimalistic set of political and social freedoms or whatever, but who, when confronted with ICE coming in and, wreaking terror upon their community, have organized themselves, and I'm thinking obviously of Minneapolis, in ways that are very clearly anti-fascist, even if they are not themselves using that language or making recourse to that historical tradition in order to explain what they're doing. And we will have all seen, these sort of clips of everyday people saying, I've never been to a protest before, I've never done anything like this before. And then ICE kidnapped the dad of one of my kids' classmates at their preschool. And that's unacceptable. And so now I'm getting up at 4 a.m. every day and driving to school kids of undocumented or mixed status families so that they don't get picked up by the ICE Gestapo waiting outside their school. And so I think I would hesitate to say that that it is axiomatic that the centrists and liberals will always defect to the far right when the question is called. I think we have to look very carefully at, okay, well, where in the society are a particular set of centrists and liberals located, and look at basically, the sort of questions of class and class affiliation in order to, and access to power in order to try and map out how they will behave. But certainly in the Spanish context, and I don't know if you want me to do a 2-second primer on the Spanish Civil War, because I feel like this is, okay, because this is a history that I certainly didn't know all that much about before I started researching this project, to be quite frank. I knew the basic outlines, but really not, I had in my head that the great story that is the anti-fascists versus the fascists and the destruction of democracy at the hands of fascism abetted by the Western powers, and that's it. And that is still the big story. But within that story, I think there are some textures that are more useful actually for understanding precisely that second dynamic, the sort of what to do with the reflexive secession or exit of liberals from Popular Front-ish coalitions that also include socialists and communists and people of the ideological left. And then the third piece, which is the sort of question of left-wing strategy when trying to conceptualize mobilizing against whether you want to call it fascism or far-right authoritarianism or whatever term you want to use, is there a kind of recruitable past in the history of the Spanish Republic that could be useful in that regard? And that, I think, is an open question. I think the closest analog that I'm familiar with would be the pink tide in the Americas. And there, the similarity to some of the reforms that the Republic tried to institute in the first 2 years of its existence in 1931 and 1932, agrarian reform, secularization, stuff like that, reform of the military, had a similar dimension in that the backlash that both of those reformist projects engendered, both the Republic in its moment in the early 30s and the pink tide in what has produced the current far-right resurgence in Latin America, which is very clearly a response to the pink tide, right? In both of those instances, the backlash is produced not because the modernizing, left-ish, secularizing, whatever reforms were so radical, but actually because they were not radical enough. What they did was to make some changes that diminished the power and influence of established sectors, but did not go so far as to defang them. And so actually agitated and activated, provided the right with something to mobilize around, did enough to basically anger them, and not so much as to actually eliminate their ability to remobilize and then regain control of the levers of power. And so that is an interesting, I think, parallel that I've been thinking about a lot, which is not to say, well, therefore it would have been so easy for, the pink tide to, nationalize everything, and then there wouldn't have been a backlash at all. It's not that, but it's thinking about sort of the extent to which when any kind of coalition that includes the left is able to actually gain power in a particular national context, is the move to be as moderate as possible, to make sure that that we take great pains to smooth off the rough edges of the radical project that we're envisioning, or is the move instead to swing for the fences while you can, because the backlash will come anyway. And that, I think, is I don't generally like to think about lessons from history, but that, I think, is actually like a pretty good lesson from the experience of the Republic, with its infinite fragmentations, self-sabotage, all of the ways in which it was not, I think, the kind of project that we would necessarily want to look to as a model. They did try to do some pretty radical things within the context of their time. And I think where they stopped short was what actually created the space for the enormity of the right-wing reaction against them. I don't know if that answers any of the million elements to your very rich and multifaceted question, but that's my first stab.
Yeah. We'll get back.
Yeah, of course. We always get back. That's how we do. Recursively, endlessly.
So going back to the beginning of the story, maybe not exactly the Spanish Civil War itself, but to that time period, could you speak to what the Spanish Civil War meant for different actors in Latin America? So both for the ruling elites and conservative forces on the one hand, and to leftist and progressive movements on the other hand. And so kind of within that question, two sub-questions, I guess. So on the right, how did the Spanish Civil War and Franco's successful coup reframe the relationship of South American elites to their roots, to their Hispanic, their Iberian roots, and the meaning of their conservative, their anti, at some point, post-colonial agenda and legitimacy? And then on the left, what lessons were drawn from the Spanish Republican moment and its tragic fate?
So I think to get at that, it is necessary to rewind to the 19th century and to talk about the curious way in which most of what are today the independent republics of the Americas came into being. Because Latin America mostly decolonizes itself far, far earlier, right? And in a far less radical fashion than we see in the 1950s and 60s and 70s with what we think of as the true moment of global decolonization, right? And in those movements, there is a full-throated repudiation of colonialism writ large and all of the racial and economic extractive hierarchies that were necessary to its functioning for as long as it did. In Latin America, it's a little different. Because basically what you get, there's this wonderful book that I like quite a bit that, Will, you probably have come across, Josh Simon's The Ideology of Creole Revolution, which is very helpful, I think, for understanding the ways in which the formal disarticulation of most of the former Spanish American republics from Spain is not a revolutionary process. Its protagonists are not seeking a repudiation of the old colonial order, an upending of the caste system. Rather, what the Creoles, the European descended, the American-born Spaniards, who are basically the regents of the Spanish colonial system, the people who run it on a day-to-day basis, they who lead and direct the independence armies, what they want is autonomy. They want to be the ones in charge of the system and just kind of cut out the middleman of having to report back to the crown and pay the taxes and deal with the meddling of the Bourbons and all of this stuff. And so, what they seek is a kind of self-decapitation, right? Almost an installation of themselves at the top of, they want to decapitate the Spain part of the colonial order, but basically leave the rest of it more or less intact. And they are forced by the fact that the rank and file of the independence armies are overwhelmingly made up of Afro-descendant, indigenous, and mestizo combatants who say, basically, look, if you want us to fight for you, you better abolish slavery. You better institute legal equality when we establish these new republics, or else that's what you owe us, right? Because you couldn't have won without us, and that was true. And so that you see abolition take root across the Americas far, far earlier than it does, for example, in the United States. But otherwise, what there is not in the process by which the former Spanish America becomes independent is there is not a repudiation of the idea that Europeanness and Iberianness, literally like Hispanidad, Spanishness, is the sort of superior fount of culture, of language, of faith, of all of the stuff that sort of is the cultural politics of these new places. And so that becomes very interesting, right? So there is a long tradition in the world of Latin American letters and politics of referring to Spain as the madre patria, right? The mother country, in ways that are very difficult to imagine coming out of the mouth of like Kwame Nkrumah or Lumumba, you know what I mean? Like, that's not the vibe, right? But the vibe in the 19th century Americas is we don't want to be ruled by old tyrannical Spain, but nevertheless, it is in the Spanishness, the Europeanness of the Creoles that their claim to A, whiteness, and B, sort of natural rulership inheres. And so you get this funky kind of Gramscian passive revolution situation in which you achieve independence without any kind of thoroughgoing repudiation of the old order. And that means that you have a population of folks who are still very invested in the idea that it is their European inheritance and heritage that renders them naturally qualified and deserving of retaining control of the system. And so and then in 1898, with the Spanish-American War, then Spain loses its final American possessions, right? Cuba and Puerto Rico kind of fall into the US neo-colonial orbit. Spain enters into crisis because now we don't have an empire anymore, and this occasions, a whole set of national hair tearing that I shouldn't minimize it by saying hair tearing, but there's a kind of national set of very angsty debates that end up hardening into the positions that basically become the Republic and the counter-revolution, right? In the Americas, what there is a kind of receptiveness, I think, among Euro-descendant elites to the idea that it is in some fundamental way their Spanishness, their claim to a more essential and, as we get to the end of the 19th century, kind of biological, genealogical connection to the church, to the Castilian language, that is civilization. And that what the Spanish Empire imposed itself onto in the New World, which is the indigenous and then the Afro-descendant, that is the barbarism, right? And it is through the Iberian tradition that we can actually, that is basically our kind of our logic of patriarchal whiteness. And so when the nationalist insurgency kind of bursts to the fore in 1936, and says, this is the way that we defeat Marxism. It's by turbocharging our imperial values of hierarchy, order, gender norms, Catholic religion, Castilian language. There is an audience in the Americas for that set of arguments. And that set of arguments and the framings that are used by the Spanish right are borrowed in some instances and dovetail nicely with things that are already happening among Latin American elites who are, by the time we get to the 20s and 30s, very invested in putting down versions of something that might amount to a Mexican revolution in their own territories, right? So that's the kind of long backstory of why I think it is that the Latin American right is so enthusiastic about the Spanish insurrection in 1936. And so that's so in terms of like, what do Latin Americans think about the Spanish Civil War? On one level, it's the same thing that happens all over the world, right? Which is that people who identify themselves as anti-fascists, as modernizers, as secularizers, see in the Republic the kind of great hope of that set of political projects, right? And that affiliate themselves with it. And that's very much the energy that motivates people to join the international brigades and to go, you know. And then on the other hand, the kind of reflexive identification of conservatives and elites with the nationalist insurgent project is like, that's the same whether we're talking about Chile or we're talking about England, or we're, like that's just kind of class solidarity. But the different piece in the Latin American context is this post-colonial legacy. The idea that this isn't just a thing happening in a place that is Spain. This is the thing that's happening in the madre patria. It's happening to our blood, our people, and therefore it is an augur that the conflict there is always already contained within ourselves, because we are the children of this mother. Excuse me. And so the idea that what was happening in Spain meant something more in the Americas because of that colonial history. That's the sort of the difference, I think. And that comes out very, very clearly in the writings and public actions and organizing and mobilizing, either of leftists on behalf of the Republic, and there's all kinds of, fundraising and solidarity and writing and, all the same stuff that you see in other parts of the world. And similarly, the participation of an endorsement of the nationalist insurgent project and the ensuing dictatorship by various sectors of the right all over the continent is this idea that this is ours. This is, and in Cuba, for example, when the Spanish Civil War breaks out in 1936, 15% of the people resident on the island of Cuba are just Spaniards. Like, Cuba hasn't even been independent from Spain for more than 30 years. So it is true, actually, that it is a kind of, there's a satellite relationship there that is different, that has a different set of meanings than it would for even, the most committed and solidaristic Irish brigadistas or, the most colluding American, oil businessmen who are giving Franco, cheap oil on credit or whatever, and fostering, supporting the nationalist victory in that way. It is in that post-colonial question, this idea of we never really resolved the issue of what is Spain to us because of the contingencies of the way in which our republics became independent. And maybe now this conflict is a chance for us to figure out, well, do we buy this idea that Spain is our mother? That's kind of a reactionary, terrible idea. Like, what tremendous violence and violation is bound up in the notion that the imperial power is still talked about by us as our mother. Like, when we're talking about our enslaver, when we're talking about the mother who stripped us of all of our golden resources, who enslaved our people, who murdered, who effectuated a 16th century genocide of our population. Like, how insane and perverse is it that it is still a commonplace in our world of letters and politics to talk about this place as being to which that we are somehow umbilically connected. And so the Spanish Civil War was an opportunity for a bunch of folks on the left to repudiate that whole concept and to say, no, we are actually the vanguard. Spain is, has been, sort of dragging its heels, clinging to feudalism and the landed aristocracy for as long as it possibly can. We are the vanguard of modernism, of change, of industrialization, and they're the ones who need to look to us, right? Maybe actually the filial relationship is different, versus the kind of set of right-wing arguments that are, doubling down on that idea of a kind of essentially umbilical connection to the mother country, because it is in that umbilical connection that the sort of white patriarchy continued legitimacy and claims to natural authority resides. That was a lot of blah, blah, but
So,
this is the historian problem, right? Is like, you ask a question about the 1930s, and I'm like, let's go back to 1810.
yeah, not a problem. That's what we're here for. So now, even though 1945 isn't such a crucial date for South America, nonetheless, let's talk about the early post-Second World War refraction of the Spanish Civil War lens in some of the cases, some of the countries that you've studied especially closely. So Guatemala would be one, Cuba would be another one, Argentina would be a third one, with this more bizarre singular thing, which is Peronismo, which can be claimed from the left sometime, but still has very strong links to Francoism in particular. And then the one that is probably the more spitting mirror image of the Spanish Revolution, or at least using it more adamantly as its lens, which is Chile.
Yeah. Yes. So, and this is another, I think, advantage of approaching the question of the Spanish Civil War from outside of Europe, right? Because there is a whole sort of, discourse that the Spanish Civil War was the kind of opening act, it was the dry run, it was the dress rehearsal for World War II, right? It was basically a proxy war of aggression on the part of the Axis powers, and as soon as it ends, it's basically immediately superseded by the real show, which is World War II, right? And that is a kind of a Europe-centric framework, I think. In Latin America, where again World War II it's important, obviously, they don't want to minimize it, but the 1930s in Spain are not immediately superseded by the Second World War, in part because the sequelae, not just the aftermath or the legacies, but like the very real relationships of people, resources, ideas, texts transatlantically actually kind of intensifies after the fighting ends in Spain. So for example, like I have, letters, correspondence from phalangists in the Americas who say, it was great once the war ended because we could actually get access to all of these phalangist texts that we had a really hard time getting during the war because, shipping was interrupted, because they weren't being printed by the government publishing houses in the way that they were once Franco took power, et cetera. So it became much more easy for Latin American right-wingers to access the sort of intellectual apparatus, such as it was, of the right-wing coalition that ends up cohering into Franco's unitary party. Then there is, of course, this massive exodus of exiles, Republican exiles. And, the numbers are not huge. Like far greater numbers of Republican exiles end up staying in France than actually make it across the ocean. But it's still probably about 40,000 people, which is a lot of people, of whom by far the lion's share go to Mexico. And then smaller shares go, there's actually there's 3 countries that officially accept Republican refugees while the Spanish Civil War is going on in Latin America. One is Mexico, which is governed by its own basically kind of popular frontist in all but name government of Lázaro Cárdenas, that's sort of doing the most of any post-revolutionary government to actually implement the ideals of the Mexican Revolution. And Cárdenas basically makes himself the number one ally of the Republic. It doesn't have the resources that the Soviet Union could contribute, which were themselves far less than what the Axis powers contributed to Franco, but which nevertheless was more than Mexico. Mexico could provide boundless solidarity and not a ton of resources, right? But one of the things that they did was they welcomed from the jump large numbers of refugees. And those refugees ended up having, really important impacts in a whole variety of aspects of Mexican cultural and political and economic life. So fine, there's that. Then the second country that officially takes in Republican refugees is Chile. And that's in much smaller numbers. They take about 3,000 of them, most of whom come on a single boat that is the political project of Pablo Neruda, the poet, who is serving So Chile is the third country in the 1930s to elect a formally popular, self-identifyingly popular front government, right after France and Spain. And so Chile elects its popular front in 1938. And so it's late in the Spanish Civil War, but Neruda is sent to Paris as a special consul of the Chilean Popular Front government with the charge of figuring out a way of bringing some Republicans back to Chile, despite the fact that the Chilean right is like, no, don't bring all of these Marxists, this is terrible. And so Neruda arranges the transfer of this shipload on a boat called the Winnipeg that arrives in Valparaiso in 1939, and very famously Salvador Allende, who was the Minister of Health in this Popular Front government, goes to the dock to personally receive these refugees, a number of whom end up actually occupying very important roles in his government once he's elected to power in 1970. So there's a whole kind of story there of this infusion of the Republican project and Republican exile ideas into the longer running project of the Chilean left. The third country that officially accepts Republican refugees for a period of time, and this is the weird one, is the Dominican Republic. The Dominican Republic is ruled by the brutal Trujillo dictatorship at the time, and so you wouldn't think, oh, Trujillo is someone who sympathizes with the Republic. He was a hardcore Hispanist. He loved Franco. He was, very in with Franco once the dictatorship sets in Spain. But the other thing that Trujillo is profoundly racist against Haitians in particular. And in 1937, his regime had carried out this vicious massacre of Haitians along the Dominican-Haitian borderlands, known as the Parsley Massacre. And so Trujillo had he was looking for a way to sort of repair his reputation on the international scene, and also to continue his ongoing project of trying to whiten the Dominican population. And so the idea of being able to bring in an infusion of proper Spaniards, even if they were leftists, was worth it to him. And so there's a population of about 5,000 Republican refugees who come to the Dominican Republic under Trujillo. Then Trujillo realizes, I think, what their sort of ideological valence was, and he cuts it off. But those migrants, before they all end up basically leaving the Dominican Republic because they're like, we left one dictatorship, we don't want to end up in another one. They go to Mexico, they go to Cuba, they go elsewhere. But not before forming the DR's first communist party, organizing agrarian workers in the Dominican countryside, et cetera. So there's this whole kind of lovely little history in which Trujillo gets a certain comeuppance by virtue of the terrible racist logic by which he allowed a group of these Republican exiles to relocate. Anyway, this is all tangents, but this story, this book that I'm writing, is this collection of just the wildest little tangents like this. Anyhow, after the war ends, exiles come as they can, although the Second World War makes it increasingly difficult for folks to transit. And so there's sort of a wave of refugees that relocate to the Americas in 1939 and 1940, and then a second wave who come in like 1947, 48, 49, once the incipient UN kind of International Refugee Agency creates a program to try to facilitate their exit. And those folks are important, not least because what ends up relocating with these exiles to the Americas is what remains of the Republican government, which then tries to reconstitute itself in exile, first in Paris and then in Mexico City, and tries to do the work of continuing to fight the fight against Franco from the diaspora. And they're not successful. But there's a number of years in which kind of the politics of what's going on in Latin America are essential to basically whether the Franco regime is able to hang on and outlast the war or not. So you mentioned Argentina. Argentina, under Perón, basically, and then after Perón, under Perón, provides an economic lifeline to Franco that allows him to survive the really tricky sort of 1946 to 1950 period in which you would think that having won the Second World War and having defeated fascism, the Allies would get around to saying, well, Franco, you are a right-wing theocratic dictator who was installed by Nazis. You don't get to stay in charge anymore. We are going to remove you and we are going to force democratic elections in Spain. This is what the exiles thought would happen. No one imagined when they fled that Franco was going to run Spain for 35 years. No, that was not, his dictatorship felt very ephemeral in the beginning. And so the efforts to keep Spain exiled from the nascent UN and all of its institutions, to try and kind of maintain Franco as like a pariah state, were both led by Latin American diplomats, Mexicans, Guatemalans, Uruguayans, and also undermined by Latin Americans, Perón in particular, who, because of various affinities with, again, the place where the political spectrum becomes a circle, third way corporatism, right, and certain kinds of elective affinities there, Perón ends up actually kind of supporting Franco while this other set of Latin American actors are working to defeat him. And it's not until 1955, when Franco's Spain is finally let into the UN, that Franco says, aha, I have finally won the Spanish Civil War. That's his quote. Not till 1955. So again, like this is where I think the language of like afterlives and legacies serves us not that well. And the concept of like survie or supervivencia or whatever serves us a lot better, because the Spanish Civil War didn't stop happening in 1939. It just changed form. It started happening in some different locations. But the core kind of ideological and political conflicts motivating at the engines of it don't just shut off on April 1st, 1939, because Franco declares victory. It just becomes a different kind of war. Right? A different kind of war of position for whether or not this regime is going to survive and is going to totally give the lie to the idea, to the self-flattering narrative of the West that it conclusively defeated fascism in 1945 and ushered democracy into the world, because that was bullshit. They just let Franco keep throwing political prisoners in jail and murdering people for 3 more decades, because Franco made Spanish territory available for the building of US military bases at the mouth of the Mediterranean, because he rehabilitated himself as a useful ally in what was now the global fight against anti-communism. And so that's the sort of beginning of that story. And in Guatemala, which had been, so the first country, actually before Hitler's Germany and before Mussolini's Italy, the first countries to actually officially recognize the nationalist insurgency as the legitimate government of Spain were Guatemala and El Salvador. And so Guatemala was, kind of a long-running dictatorship. And then the reason why 1945 is really important in Latin America is not because it's the end of the Second World War per se, but it's because domestic reformers and leftists, but progressives, I think, a kind of popular front coalition of folks, take seriously the narratives of the Western powers that, okay, fascism is done, we're doing democracy now, and we're not going to get in the way if you all try to do democracy in your own countries. They all said, great. And across the whole hemisphere, there was this massive set of peaceful revolutions that overthrew dictatorships from Guatemala all the way down to the Southern Cone. And so that was really consequential. And one of the places that happens is Guatemala, where there is this kind of reformist nationalist revolution that yields the first ever democratic elections in the country. They extend the vote to the indigenous majority of the population that had never before been able to vote.
That's 44?
45, yeah. And they start instituting steps toward what becomes a kind of more thoroughgoing agrarian reform in 1952 and whatever. But they have this democratic government, and they know that they are up against the same political phenomena, the same kind of brewing backlash, the same constellation of forces that rose up to destroy the Republic. They identify themselves very much with the Republican project, and they see coming the counter-revolution. The thing that they don't see coming is the United States then deciding, okay, we're gonna pick sides and then give the counter-revolution massive amounts of communications equipment, training, guns, political cover, planes, propaganda, all of this stuff. But otherwise, the basic dynamic of we are doing a social democratic project. We're doing an elected social democratic project unto a country that we want to modernize. We want to do some land reform. We want to do some political opening. We want to legalize unions. We want to legalize strikes. We want to legalize the Communist Party. We want to actually do democratic pluralism. That is the thing that the Republic did, and that was the thing that they had to destroy. And we know that they will come for us too. And then they did. And the counter-revolution, as it came into being in Guatemala, was overtly phalangist in inspiration, in the writings of its key protagonists, in the way that they framed their whole, this is a country that's majority indigenous. And so the idea of Spanishness, of Hispanidad as being the fount of civilization to be imposed upon indigenous barbarism is very, very extra resonant there. And this is a country where the oligarchs assiduously trace their bloodlines back to the original 16th century conquistadors, and explicitly so. And so they are very invested in the idea that it is Spanish imperialism and Spanishness that are the tools with which the native barbarity must be contained and extirpated and reshaped. And so that whole set of tropes is very, very useful when they're trying to recruit a basically consensus for the counter-revolution that they effectuated in 1954. And then it gets all tangled up in, sort of US geopolitics and the CIA and the United Fruit Company and whatever. But the reality is that before...
Which is the next question.
Is it?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, but the reality is that before the coup that succeeded in 1954 in overthrowing Arbenza's democratically elected government, hounding all of its supporters into exile, and erecting a Hispanist fascist military dictatorship on top of the ashes of that project, before that coup succeeded, the one that the US threw in on, there had been dozens and dozens of previous coup attempts against those two democratic administrations from 44 to 54, which is the same period of time that Franco is fighting for his life, trying to get himself into the UN, doing secret pacts with the Vatican, with the United States government, etc., kind of reorganizing himself as this paladin of Cold War anti-communism. At the same time, these Guatemalans who realize that this counter-revolution is coming for them are at the UN fighting for the Republic. It's not that there's like a 1939 and then this after, it's all the same thing, right? It is a political continuum in which they understand themselves very clearly to be living a version of what their Republican counterparts had lived. And in part, that's because there are Republicans there in Guatemala. They did a resettlement campaign there too, telling them all about it, and experiencing that sense of deja vu as the counter-revolution is realized. So what's the next question?
Yeah, so that's a great prelude to the next question, which is about the right, and focusing on maybe a couple of the threads that you just laid down there. The question's about how the US-backed military dictatorships from the 50s up to the 80s negotiate their relationship with Francoism and more generally to Spain. So the first question here is, how did the Reconquista imaginary reappropriated by Franco play out in South America and Latin America? And this is a context where the pride of the criollos was combining their Hispanidad with forms of nationalism, anti-post colonial nationalism and their whiteness with a Catholic civilizing mission? So that's the first question.
Okay.
Another question
Why don't I just answer the first question?
Well, you could.
No, it's okay. I love a multi-part
question. The second one here is related, and that is, to what extent were communists, but also some social democrats, liberals, social movements, indigenous and feminist social movements, racialized to fit this regenerative fascist or quasi-fascist project in Spain, this moment where Spain and its regime were in kind of terminal decline. And the kind of background to this question, of course, is that the Spanish Civil War framework is playing out alongside or during a neoliberal model, a la the Chicago Boys, and a neoconservative model also, a la the kind of U.S. positioning of Jeane Kirkpatrick, dividing some governments along either authoritarian or totalitarian designation, so as to figure out when exactly you're going to intervene. So different dimensions there.
Yeah. So this is really important because this is another tie-in to the contemporary world, right? Which is that the political project of Francoism sells itself, I think, to the United States in particular as being, sort of primarily anti-communist. But the real target is not Bolshevism per se. I mean, that's a target. But the real sort of phenomenon that the Spanish far right sees as the kind of the poisonous core of all of our problems today is the Enlightenment. And the thing that they want to reverse, or the moment that they want to return to, is like an idealized version of the early modern Spanish village in which that are governed by the subsidiarity principle, where, the guilds of church and army and family are the sort of the glue that binds together the social order, in which verticality and hierarchy are core principles, in which you have a confessional state, all of this stuff. And so they hate the Enlightenment because they think that liberalism, basically, as they understand it, and liberal universalism are a slippery slope that makes possible communism later. But it's not enough to just cut off the head of communism, because then you still have the slippery slope of liberalism creating all kinds of deformed modern ideas about universal suffrage or gender equality or secularism, or things that don't have to go so far as to be explicitly communist or socialist in their realization, to continue to nevertheless threaten that early modern idealized hyper-hierarchical vertical order. And so so that's one current that I think that I have been very interested to see the resurgence of explicitly in contemporary far-right discourse, where there are, very overt, particularly in the US, right, like this kind of new fawning over Franco, right? This is sort of the Rod Dreher, Catholic integralist universe of post-liberals. Like, that is all super, super consonant with the Francoist project. The other piece in terms of the racialization is that during the Spanish Civil War itself, there was an army psychiatrist who fought with a nationalist named Antonio Vallejo Nájera. And Vallejo Nájera did a version of a kind of set of Mengele-style experiments on Republican political prisoners in 1938 and 1939 with Franco's permission, the purpose of which was to prove his idea of what he calls la eugenesia de la hispanidad, Hispanic eugenics. And so this was a kind of biophilosophical Frankenstein kind of theory. It's hard to use the tools of intellectual history on some of these guys because But nevertheless, having read the voluminous literary production, so shall we say, of this particular guy, they certainly thought of themselves as intellectuals and conducted themselves as such. But so the idea of these experiments that Vallejo Nájera was given official license to conduct was that there was a red gene, that basically Marxism had an epigenetic dimension, and that the eugenics of Hispanidad, of Hispanity, were basically inhered in a kind of spiritual brotherhood of the Castilian language and the Catholic faith. That this was the raza, the race. And it's weird because it's a race whose primary characteristics are not bloodline, but are rather traits that one could opt into by learning the language and by adopting the faith, right? But that's the whole colonial evangelizing principle, that you can kind of enter the race if you accept the Spanish imperial metaphysics, right? But so in the eugenics of Hispanity, according to this character who after the Civil War gets elevated, he basically becomes like the most powerful psychiatrist in Franco's medical establishment and is hugely influential in the medical profession under the dictatorship for decades. So he's a big deal and people read him in Latin America. But so this idea that, okay, so the race, which is this faith and language-based spiritual fraternity, is threatened by the invading virus of the red gene of Marxism, and that therefore, and that the red gene produces psychotic and schizophrenic behaviors such as the reversal of tradition, or the undermining of traditional gender roles, the destruction of the family, all of this kind of stuff. The gender ideology, as we would call it in kind of contemporary far-right terms. And so he develops this whole theory of how you can allegedly square the Catholic social doctrine with an exterminationist project to destroy the corrupting influence of the red gene in order to save the Hispanic race. And one of the ways that you do that, according to Dr. Vallejo Nájera, is when you have children who are born into left-wing families. You can't kill the children. You oughtn't to kill the children, although they did sometimes, and they certainly killed the parents, but you oughtn't to kill the leftists involved. But what you must do is you must separate the children from the left-wing family. And the theory being that if the children are exposed to the proper spiritual fraternity of the Hispanic raza, that they can be redeemed, that you can basically fight and defeat the virus of Marxism and the red gene by limiting its expression through the rehoming of literally stolen children to be raised by patriotic, nationalist, right-wing Christian families. And so this gets elevated in the Franco dictatorship to the level of state policy and informs generations of baby stealing, honestly, of ripping children, infants, from their birth families, often with the parents incarcerated and political prisoners, and rehoming them through phalangist state-run networks of orphanages with the collusion of the Catholic Church. And this is a phenomenon that in Spain, contemporary activists and survivors, victims of this system, are continuing to dig through the traces of. This is very much an ongoing political issue in contemporary Spain. Later on, once you have the onset of the high Cold War era dictatorships in Latin America, in several of them, we also see the concerted policy of military juntas to destroy families in this fashion with the idea of rehabilitating the race from its having been infected by the red virus. So there is an explicit biologization of an assumed set of left ideological positions that is used as justification for the, and most, I think people know this story most vividly in Argentina. where the project of the mothers and the grandmothers of the Plaza de Mayo has been to try and restore the identities of some of the infants, many of whom were born in captivity to imprisoned mothers who were subsequently murdered by the state, to try and restore the identities of those children who number roughly 500 or so, although that's probably an undercount in total. And the madres and the abuelas have identified now about 150 of them. But that is similarly still a project that is ongoing. And one of the Argentine forensic geneticists who helped develop the DNA testing protocols that have allowed those social movement organizations to identify using new DNA tools, to identify those stolen children, now adults, biological identities, said explicitly the Argentine junta was following the teachings of Vallejo Nájera when they did this to our people. So there are very explicit connections there to a form of eliminationist ideology and practice that presented itself as being consonant with and originating from Catholic doctrine, which is insane, for lack of a better term, in one sense. But it wasn't just in Argentina, it also happened in Guatemala, it also happened in El Salvador. And so, you know, there are a variety of ways in which these practices that were established by the Franco dictatorship, and which the dictatorship attempted quite explicitly, not always successfully, but had organizations and a kind of bureaucratic apparatus to try and export to Latin America through the 40s and 50s and 60s. We see that those seeds took root, right? Then on the economic question, right, and the sort of neoliberalism, Chicago Boys, as you mentioned, sort of that whole piece of things. There's a great new book by a historian named Daniel Kressel called Hispanic Technocracy. And what it looks at is how Franco's Spain, Ongania's Argentina, so the dictatorship, one of the dictatorships immediately before the 1976 junta, that is the one that most people are familiar with, but the Onganía dictatorship from 66 to 70, which was explicitly Francoist, and then Chile under Pinochet, how they basically, how in those three societies, regimes that originated very much out of a kind of Hispanist, corporatist economic model or set of ideas transformed themselves into early versions of neoliberalism. And Opus Dei is a really big part of that story. And interestingly, this is another one of my little like Spanish Civil War rabbit holes. So Jose Maria Escrivá, who is the Spanish prelate, the cleric who founds Opus Dei, the reason that he survives the Spanish Civil War to then go on and actually create the global empire of Opus Dei is because the Honduran legation, the diplomatic office of Honduras in Madrid during the Spanish Civil War, shelters him for 6 months while the anti-fascist militias are roaming around Madrid trying to kill precisely people like this guy. They hide him, they protect him, they give him Honduran diplomatic papers, and when the fighting kind of eases up in Madrid a little bit, he uses his Honduran fake ID basically to get himself out of Madrid and into the nationalist zone, whereupon he goes on to create what we now know as the sort of whole global situation of Opus Dei, which, among other things, provides many of the technocrats who actually effectuate the sort of second phase of the Franco dictatorship's economic turn toward economic liberalization, basically, and who then also are very influential among the Chicago Boys and in the whole sort of universe of Latin Americans who are experimenting with deregulatory economic policies in the late 60s and into the early 70s. And you know, Chile being the kind of most famous laboratory for that, but not the only place where there was an effort to basically modernize and adapt the authoritarianism of interwar fascism into a kind of economic policy that could be compatible with some extent of liberal electoral democracy, right? With the institutions of electoral democracy. How can we basically engineer the economy in ways that will allow us to perpetuate this system past the point when it is no longer politically possible for us to maintain overt military dictatorships. And that is what, and Chileans today are still dealing with the sequelae of that, one of the things that Franco is sort of one of his catchphrases that he's most famous for is that as, because Franco was dying for a long time, right? Like you use the phrase terminal decline in one of your questions, and that's exactly, he was dying for a long time, right? There was a Saturday Night Live joke about this for many, many years, right? Generalissimo Francisco Franco is still dead. And so he was like on life support for a really, really, really long time, and he finally dies. And, so as it becomes clear that he's entering the long run of dying, he takes care to leave things institutionally in Spain such that, as he imagines, Franquismo will survive the man himself, right? And so the phrase is that he's left everything atado y bien atado, right? I've left everything all tied up. And Chileans use that language very explicitly to talk about the ways in which the Pinochet dictatorship similarly left everything muy bien atado with the 1980 Constitution, with the way that they rewrote labor law, and with the privatization of education, with the economic model, right? El modelo de Chile. And so that is a set of fetters that Chilean activists are continuing to strain against as they try and envision a different kind of modality for the 21st century. And, that Cast having just been elected as a kind of overt, ardent Pinochetista, I think speaks to the ongoing vitality, unfortunately, of that project.
Before I turn to the left, just listening to you, and especially about Nájera, that's his last name?
Vallejo Nájera. Yeah, his grandchildren went to Harvard. One of my research assistants found out, interestingly, quite recently, which is we do not get to pick our grandparents, to be very clear, so no aspersions. But it was just interesting that this is a surname that still circulates, right? So, Vallejo Nájera.
Yes, so listening to you talking about him and at the risk of sort of validating his, philosophical bona fide, it seems to me that it's quite remarkable in his theory. It's, in a way, an inverted form of racialism if you compare it to the late 19th century German, French, or even American racialism, in the sense that in the European model, the pure race is the white race or the Aryan race, whatever you want to call it, and then the others, the inferior ones, are sort of mixed race, right? So it's kind of a dilution of the purity. Whereas with him, it seems to be reverted, in the sense that the only pure one are those who carry the red genes, whereas the white people have much more universalist possibility in the sense that, as you said, if they take on the proper religion, if they're accultured in the right way, then they become fully white. So you can become white, but you cannot escape redness, except if you are taken as a baby and put in a white family. So it's a very specific racialism. So it's not that I want to, elevate him as a true philosopher.
No, totally.
Though in the age of Curtis Yarvin, what's the threshold for being a philosopher?
This is the thing.
But nonetheless, it's a remarkable and very singular form of racialism there.
Yeah, and it also comes out of this Crusades, Reconquista mentality where, they basically, where if Jews convert and become conversos, then they're allowed to provisionally remain part of the polity, although their authority will always be suspect, right? And they can always be undermined. And this, so Franco was a raging anti-Semite, right? And this is a part of the whole Spanish Civil War story that doesn't get talked about as much. But his bugbears were, the Judeo-Masonic Bolshevik conspiracy. That was who he had in his sight lines. And that comes out of, then the enemies are non-Catholics, liberals, incarnated in the Spanish context as Freemasons, right, and Bolsheviks. But that's kind of the trinity of evil, right, is to not be Catholic, to be a liberal, and to be a Marxist. And those things are kind of co-equivalent. So like the idea that racial, that the sort of supremacy inheres in a religious interpretation of the race is, I think, particular to the Spanish imperial formation and 1492 and the Reconquest and all of that stuff, in a way that it's not elsewhere in Europe. But yeah, it does. The problem is that there is the theory of what someone like Vallejo Nájera put down on paper, and then there is the reality of what the regime actually did, how the regime actually operationalizes these ideas. And the reality is that they just kill whoever they want to, and they kind of forget the theories, right? So like, yes, we can redeem, we can be good Catholics by not murdering the families of the leftists and giving the children beautiful new homes. But then in practice, they actually just, left the leftist parents to rot and die in jail or shot them by firing squad or whatever else. So, there was a lot of apparatus around the kind of cocktail of right-wing variants that are present in Franquismo, but the practice of it is really just the sort of exercise and consolidation of power and the elimination of dissent, challenges to rule, etc. And there are fractions and there are rivalries within the Spanish right, even at the height of the dictatorship, and Franco was able to kind of put them down, manage them, resolve them, get rid of, a troublesome individual or someone who's, angering some other segment of the coalition. But basically the coalition hangs together. And, in a way that that history does not give us a ton of examples of left coalitions being able to do. And it is in this way, among probably other ways, that Franco and Trump are, kind of confrères of a certain type, in that they both seem to have this kind of preternatural talent for managing teams of rivals from, quite different positions on issues like abortion or the church or economic policy or whatever, and is able to manage basically through the sort of force of personality and a relentless focus on who the enemy is, what is the worse evil, is able to actually build quite enduring right-wing political coalitions that seem, thus far, at least in the Trump version of it, to be able to surf over what would, in other kinds of political contexts or in different sort of ideological arrangements, would be like devastating cleavages or fissures within those coalitions.
So now shifting to the left once again, in the first big age of military dictatorship throughout South America, how does the survival of the Civil War operates in the various strands of the left at the time? So on the one hand, to what extent, and it seems to a large extent, does Allende sees his project as some kind of a repetition or maybe revenge or overcoming of the failure or the collapse of the Republic by reconstituting some kind of a popular front? But also at the same time, in different countries, but in Chile also, those who decide that faced with military dictatorship, only the armed struggle is the path to Palmaros and others. And how do they, and if they do, how do they refer their own Guevarista or post-Guevarista form of armed struggle to the tradition of the international brigades?
Yeah. That's a great question, and it's complicated. So I think one thing that is important to recognize at the outset is that for the whole generation of political figures who take on leadership roles in Latin American left-wing politics in the 1960s and 1970s. So Allende for sure, but also Raúl Alfonsín in Argentina, Fidel Castro and Che Guevara in Cuba, or Cuba and Argentina, respectively. The Spanish Civil War is like a defining experience of their young lives. So, Allende is a little bit older, right? He's a minister in the Chilean Popular Front government when the refugees come to Chile. Fidel and Che are younger. They're boys. They're 8 and 9 years old when the Spanish Civil War breaks out. But they both cite it as their first political memory. And it makes this tremendous impression on both of them. Now, what is the impression? That I think is a question that I don't have the tools to answer definitively. But the way that it plays out in both cases is, I think, really is interesting and is kind of important for your question. So Ernesto Guevara is, living in small town Argentina. He's 8 or 9 years old. And when the Spanish Civil War breaks out, he gets kind of obsessed with it. He's reading about it in the news. His uncle, Cayetano Cordova, is a communist war correspondent who actually goes to Spain and is writing dispatches from the front for the Argentine left press. And so he's literally sitting at his aunt's knee while she's reading out loud letters that Tío Cayetano is sending from the Spanish front. And so he's exposed to that. He turns his backyard into a scale model of Madrid. So he and his friends are playing their war games in their backyard, but they're playing the war games in a model of the city of Madrid as it's under siege from fascist insurgents, right? So what does that do for the young mind is a question. He names his dog after Juan Negrin, who was the Spanish Republican prime minister. The dog is named Negrina. She was also black, so negro, the color black in Spanish. But anyways, he names his dog after the Spanish prime minister. That's interesting, right? And at the same time, in Cuba, Fidel's father is a Spaniard. He's a Galician immigrant, first-generation immigrant to Cuba. Hundreds of thousands of Galicians left Spain in the kind of wake of the economic contraction and crisis of post-1898. They relocate to Cuba. He runs a kind of medium sugar plantation, and the community that they're in eastern Cuba is heavily populated by these Spanish immigrants. And so a lot of the farmhands and the people who work on the father's farm are also Gallegos. And so Fidel grows up kind of steeped in this Galician, to be specific, parentage. And when the war breaks out, all of the people who work on the estate are fighting about the Spanish Civil War, arguing about it with each other, and they were mostly Franquistas. They mostly thought the nationalists should win, but there was a cook who was a fire-breathing Republican and who was illiterate. And Fidel Castro had been sent off to study in boarding school and was back home for the summer, in the summer of 36 when the war breaks out. And the cook was like, can you read to me? Can you read the newspapers out loud to me so that I can follow along with the way the war is unfolding? And so Fidel Castro's first experience of following the ins and outs of a military campaign was as a 9-year-old reading out loud the reporting from the various fronts of the Spanish Civil War. What does that mean? Does that have causal effects that wouldn't have unfolded otherwise? I don't know. But certainly I think the idea that this sort of question that I alluded to back toward the beginning of our conversation of so once the left is able to gain power, do you try to go quietly and make your reforms modestly so as not to inflame the opposition, or do you swing for the fences? Right? I think the lesson, certainly for the Cuban Revolution, is you swing for the fences. But does that come directly from the Spanish Civil War for them, or does it come from the more recent experience of watching the destruction of the democratic experiment in Guatemala, which is itself a kind of refraction of the Spanish Civil War politics. So it's tricky. But, Che Guevara is in Guatemala City. So he had moved, he's a sort of itinerant medical professional, and he goes to Guatemala under Arbenz as part of the Democratic Revolution to participate in the rural public health initiatives that Arbenz had instituted to try and deal with the just devastating poverty and immiseration of the overwhelmingly indigenous Guatemalan countryside. And Che says, I want to be a part of that. The counter-revolution happens in 1954. Che narrowly escapes. He takes refuge in the Mexican embassy, and he gets exile in Mexico and ends up in Mexico City. And it's in Mexico City where Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. Fidel Castro is exiled by then for having executed and led the attack on the Moncada barracks against the Batista dictatorship in Cuba in 1953, and he gets kicked out of Cuba to Mexico. And so the reason that Fidel and Che first meet is because of these destructions of these previous kind of efforts to end dictatorship and fascism in their respective contexts. Since they end up in Mexico City, they meet each other. And Che is very explicitly interprets what happens in Guatemala as a recapitulation of the destruction of the Spanish Republic. And when they end up actually managing to sort of consolidate power in the wake of the Cuban Revolution, Che very famously goes to the OAS and says, Cuba is not going to be another Guatemala, which is to say, we are not going to step down without a fight, and we are not going to simply do a kind of reformist project. We are here to do a revolution, and we're going to fight for it. And that's what they do. So, does the experience of having observed the vehemence, the violence of the obliteration of what were a set of ultimately in their contexts pretty moderate reformist democratic initiatives like the Spanish Republic, like the Democratic Spring in Guatemala, like what would have been Jorge Gaitan's agenda had he been, as he was overwhelmingly likely to do, allowed to win the Colombian elections in 1948. Instead, he was assassinated. And then later on, certainly the experience of Chile bears this out too. But, what does it do to a bunch of people who want to open up and change and reform and revolutionize their societies to see time after time again efforts to do it through democratic means be crushed with the collusion of the ostensibly pro-democratic Western powers by local reactionaries who enjoy the support and the resources and the whatever of those powers? And is that not kind of guaranteed to produce the sort of polarization or intensify the kind of polarization that will yield some subset of people to decide that armed struggle is the way? And the trouble is that the history of left armed struggle in Latin America is not overwhelmingly one of victory. It's not it's not, the sort of folkista efforts to replicate the experience of the 26th of July movement rest upon some real misinterpretations of how it was that the 26th of July movement was indeed able to participate in the overthrow. That basically the 26th of July movement did not by itself win the overthrow of Batista and the creation of the Cuban Revolution. That actually that was in many respects, not formally so, but in practice, a Popular Front project that was just as much pushed forward by, all kinds of different associations and groups and sectors of society as it was a project of the guerrilla, right? So I I think that's where the sort of lessons, as it were, of Spain resonate. No one is saying let's go try to do the Republic again. Exactly. I think there's a lot of desire to see similar kinds of policies enacted, but I don't think anyone who knows anything about how the Spanish Republic played out in any granular detail would say, this is a great idea. Let's do that again. It really was not, and I'm happy to talk about the details of that if you want, although that's really in the weeds, but yeah, there are all kinds of ways in which folks who are displaced by the destruction of the Spanish Republic then end up washing up interestingly in the Latin American armed struggle universe. So one of them is this very colorful character named Alberto Bayo, who had been a kind of, fairly distinguished-ish in the Republican Army, ends up in Mexico City, and when Fidel and Che get together and decide that they want to continue the project of trying to overthrow Batista together, the person from whom they receive training in guerrilla methods is this veteran of the Spanish Republican Army who had written a document, a kind of guide to how to do guerrilla struggle called 150 Questions for the Guerrero, kind of a guerrilla catechism. And so they meet him in Coyoacan in Mexico City, and he spends 6 months training the various members of what they put together and what eventually becomes the people who sail on the Granma over to Cuba, most of whom get slaughtered as soon as they arrive because they're met by Batista's forces who just pick them off as they're landing. And a few of them, including Che, including Fidel, manage to escape into the Sierra Maestra, and then from there they have to kind of rebuild their movement. But so they are trained by this Republican Army veteran. There's another guy named Abraham Guillen who ends up relocating to Uruguay, and he styles himself as having been a kind of elder statesman to the Tupamaros. But I have not seen abundant evidence that that influence was much more than, he was a person who wrote a lot of stuff and some of the Tupamaros read it, but it's not as though he was like their spiritual godfather or anything like that. And in the case of Bayo, who trained the Cubans, there is also new evidence that historians have dug up that he was also a kind of double agent and that he was serving as a spy for Trujillo while at the same time he was participating in this loose anti-fascist organization called the Caribbean Legion, which in the 1940s and 1950s was running around the Caribbean trying to overthrow not just Trujillo and Batista, but also Somoza and Picado and a couple of the other dictatorships in the Caribbean. And there were a bunch of Spanish Republicans who were a part of that initiative. And so Bayo has written a ton in which he says basically, this was my contribution to the Cuban Revolution. And it's like, well, okay. You can only take people's memoirs so far. There were other ways in which veterans of the Spanish Republican Army were very important actually to the early consolidation of the Cuban Revolution, but that's a separate story. It is, I think, the turn to armed struggle is a product of it is in many ways the sort of logical consequence of watching several democratically elected left and left liberal coalitions try to use the popular electoral mandate that they enjoyed to implement changes through parliamentary and constitutional means that would have the effect of, breaking up the concentration of land among tiny handfuls of aristocrats or breaking the hold of the Catholic Church over education. This was a huge piece of the story, both in Spain and Latin America, that kind of falls out of the way that we normally tell the story. But the idea of taking the power of that creating universal basic primary education as a state project and taking it out of the hands of the church, this was just enormously controversial and divisive and inflamed the institutional church and made it an active partner in the reactionary projects to destroy those initiatives. And that's true in Spain, it's true in Guatemala, it's true elsewhere. True in Chile, where Allende does that same project as well in the 70s and it does not go that well. Now I've lost my train of thought, but all of which is to say that, yeah, of course, if you're sitting around and you're looking at, okay, well, we've tried democratic reformism, and the United States in particular, and in alliance with our local elites, will not tolerate that. They will not permit it. We now can look at Spain, we can look at Guatemala, we can look at Colombia, and so at that point, we can look at Cuba and the destruction of the Grau initiative of 1933 and 1934 by Batista. So we have a bunch of democratic constitutional projects for social transformation that are destroyed by the reactionary international and the sort of alliance with capital. And so obviously the only path forward is an armed path. And the trouble is that there are other kinds of structural obstacles to the success of the armed path that are the story of the sort of post-Foucault experiments throughout Latin America that, by and large, don't end where anyone would have wanted them to end. And in Nicaragua, which is the kind of interesting counterexample, the triumph of the Sandinista revolution in 1979 is partly effectuated by the fact that there is the guerrilla movement that has been, working, doing its thing since the 1960s, but it is also very much the product of, as with the Cuban Revolution, the sort of broad consensus of civil society, including your Chamber of Commerce and your moderate, religious authorities and your political centrists who just say the dictatorship has become intolerable. At a certain point, the military dictatorship is bad for business too, right? And that's when you get the flip. And so 1979, I think, was interpreted as a great like the Cuban Revolution, interpreted as a great triumph for the armed struggle. But I think it's quite debatable if you drill into the history whether it is actually the armed struggle that is owed the lion's share of the credit for those regimes having fallen exactly when and in the manner that they did. And of course, while this is all happening, there is an ongoing Maquis armed struggle against Francoism in Spain, which also is not what actually brings about the end of Franquismo. So, I think that if there is an overall lesson, it's not about the viability of armed struggle, but I think it is about the fact that the sort of communists and socialists have much more a much deeper and more unshakable belief in the ideals of liberalism than do the liberals, the professed liberals themselves. And one of the mechanisms for trying to do that, perversely or paradoxically, in the Cold War Latin American context is through the armed struggle, right? And there's this, another of these funny kind of Spanish Civil War aftermath parallels is a thing that Octavio Paz, the Mexican writer, says about the Spanish Civil War, basically that democracy and constitutional monarchy were the results of the Spanish Civil War. And Ramirez, the Nicaraguan intellectual I was talking about at the beginning, says the greatest legacy of our revolution was not transformative social change and end to hunger and poverty and US imperialism as we had imagined. Our greatest legacy was actually democracy, which was not necessarily our number one priority, but is something that we could live with, And so there it is. So I do think that if there is a lesson, again, sort of for the left, I think that it is in the importance of continuing to do the work of building coalitions, that is actually, to the extent that, we have seen interruptions in a long history of loss and defeat, it has been in these evanescent kind of ephemeral moments in which those popular frontist coalitions have managed to actually hold together. And so how do we do that work? Right, and that I think is the question of our present.
Great. Moving forward to this moment at the end of the century, to the transition to democracy, to truth and reconciliation commissions, to the pink tide, and the challenges you're kind of indicating already that the recent far-right wave poses to these processes or undermines the promise of them. So two questions with again to kind of focus on the Spanish Civil War. Mm-hmm. With respect to the right, what does the lasting relevance of the Spanish Civil War framework tell us about the precarious transition to democracy in many Latin American countries? And here, kind of going back to your previous book, Paper Cadavers, what role did the destruction of archives and more broadly the impunity of the military and the police play in kind of the holding forth of the Francoist legacy, could we say? And then regarding the left, mm-hmm. how influential was the Spanish Civil War imaginary in various social movements that would lead eventually to the pink tide, mm-hmm. and what we can call maybe the two pink tides. what place did it occupy, if any, in the lefts from Mujica and Bachelet to Boric and Lula, but also in the various strands of Chavismo and for the Kirchner version of the Peronist Party in Argentina?
Okay. Yes. Small question. So, okay. On the first, I mean, and to be clear, like in Spain, there is a very lively debate that continues about whether or not the contemporary far right in Spain is or is not a legacy of the Spanish Civil War, does or does not have anything to do with Franco, right? So the phenomenon is called sociological Francoism, right? The idea that even without Franco himself, even though the dictatorship itself has passed, that sociological Francoism is basically the sort of a way of naming the phenomenon by which like no part of institutional, associational, political, religious, whatever life was left untouched by this 40-year-long particular kind of personalist dictatorship. And so there's a great book by a wonderful critic named Sebastián Faber that is called Exhuming Franco. And it is a set of interviews with a whole range of Spanish intellectuals from the kind of center left to the far left, basically where they're all disagreeing with each other quite strenuously about whether or not the genealogy in which to situate the contemporary Spanish right is one of Francoism and the Spanish Civil War at all, or really if it has a lot more to do with like 19th century stuff or whatever, right? So these are unsettled questions, and I think we can't just simply say, okay, well, today the Spanish right is a kind of outgrowth of is the stepchild of Franquismo or whatever. I mean, I think people do make that argument, and there are also convincing counter-arguments to it. But one thing I will say that is true across both the Spanish and the Spanish-American contexts, and is directly related both to the impact of the Spanish Civil War as well as to the impacts of the Latin American dictatorships, is sort of who is doing the work of building those precarious, fragile, but nevertheless meaningful transitions to something sort of approaching, at the very least, a kind of minimal political democracy. And it is the people who are refusing the erasure of the past and insisting, even within deeply limited, imperfect, unsatisfying mechanisms like war crimes trials or historical memory laws or whatever, to insist that you cannot build any kind of future worth the name on the blood and silence of the past. And so there's this wonderful recent essay by a great Argentine historian named Ernesto Seman, in which he talks about, I've always wondered how the people whose families were murdered, who were hounded into exile, who had to live clandestinely, who were the enemies of these various dictatorships, didn't just, once you saw the transition to democracy kind of take formal shape, go and put bullets in the heads of the people who had murdered their families, who had tortured their children, who had disappeared their wives, etc. And he's like, and they didn't. They universally did not. They renounced violence, they renounced revenge, and they did the slow and tiring and boring work of forming political parties and running for office and filing lawsuits, even in national legal systems that were still controlled by judges who had been appointed by the very dictatorships that had murdered their families. And they protested in the streets, and they did public campaigns, and they bared their stories, and they took all kinds of risks in these very, very fragile post-dictatorship moments to insist that the society as a whole had to look in the face of what it had done, right? And that those are the people to whom we should credit whatever modicum of democratic institutionality we now see in these places. And so it's the folks who have been pushing for the exhumations of the mass graves, building the DNA databases of the stolen children, marching in the streets even as members of their organizations continue to be disappeared, receive death threats, be killed, etc. Trying to dig out what remains of an archival record of state repression. All of these things that have been profoundly uphill battles that have incurred very real consequences for the individuals who continue to do that work, and which have produced, at the end of the day, these sort of very often kind of unsatisfying political contexts in which basically everything that the left fought for through all of those prior decades, that all of those people died for, is not much in evidence, right? The socioeconomic transformation that all of those people believed in so fervently that they were willing to give their lives for it. And so what is a way to talk about the failures and inadequacies of these contemporary democratic contexts that does not diminish the importance of that labor and that work? Is there any democracy to speak of in Spain or in contemporary Latin America that is not precisely and almost exclusively due to the work of those individuals and their organizations? And I think it's really, really important to lift that up, because that is anti-fascist work in its purest essence. And again, only sometimes do those folks speak of that work in that way. But that is what it is. Like, I feel comfortable. You know, historians usually don't like to impose labels that the historical actors themselves don't use. But I think, A, a lot of the actors do use that language. And B, even if they don't, I think that is the character of the labor that they have undertaken and continue to undertake, even in profoundly hostile political climates. So there's that. Vis-a-vis the pink tide, I don't think that the pink tide was motivated by a Spanish Civil War imaginary at all. Like, I just don't. But I think it was profoundly animated by the anti-fascist imaginary of a kind of collective social repudiation of the dictatorships that preceded them, which are themselves kind of part of that tradition, right? So that's one piece. And the second piece is that the thing that I think is so crucial about the pink tide is that, so one of the arguments that I make in this book is basically that the 20th century for Latin America, which we often think of as having been essentially and primarily shaped by US imperialism, right? US intervention, US meddling, US overthrowing of Arbenz and Allende and whatever, US backing of dictatorships in Central America and elsewhere, so the anthropologist Ann Stoler talks about the duress of empire, the sort of weight, the pressure that imperial pasts exert upon more contemporary moments. And she kind of rejects the language of post-colonialism, because again, implicit in that is that we're post, that we're after it, right? And she says, well, no, it's actually kind of more of an extended and attenuated set of relations. And so one of the things I have been one of the points that I will try to make in this book is that 20th century Latin America was always operating under the duress of two empires, the United States Empire and the Spanish Empire. And what was so radical about the pink tide was, particularly in Bolivia, in Ecuador, what the pink tide governments, some of them, were able to do was actually, finally, I think, to complete the unfinished business of decolonization by creating plurinational states, by having indigenous social movements and indigenous leaders rise to positions of real power. What they were able to do was, again, not explicitly as such necessarily, but I think through action, repudiate that whole Hispanist logic that all that is modern about Latin American Republican life owes in some way to a kind of Hispanic inheritance, as opposed to was carved out at the expense of and in rejection of the idea that the fundamental thing that ties us all together is that we are the children of Spain. I think that, like, Evo Morales took that idea and rejected it, which is why in the right-wing backlash to destroy the pink tide, or at least to reverse the pink tide, we see so often recursion on the part of various movements and individuals to the language of Hispanism, Christianity, Reconquest, all of this stuff. You see this in Añez in Bolivia. You see it in the whole sort of Santa Cruz anti-mas formation in Bolivia. You see it in a less racialized sense and in a more kind of anti-Marxist sense, but similar language with Millet and, this idea of Christian civilization reconquering the forces of barbarism, reinstituting when Añez kind of marches into the parliament with the gigantic Bible, right? Like it's literally a kind of a reinstallation of the Hispanist imperial logic in situations in which, the barbarians got ideas that they actually had an alternative model. They had a different vision of the nation state, a different vision of citizenship, a different vision of who got to have power and have ideas, a different cosmovision, and an indigenous, in that case, cosmovision for the modern nation that did not necessarily explicitly repudiate the sort of madre patria legacy of Spain thing, because it didn't have to, because it incarnated that repudiation. And that, I think, was why, is part of why the reaction to the pink tide governments was, again, had that sort of virulence to it. Because it sort of it has imprinted on it all of these older ideas about who is a real citizen, who is a subject, who's fit to govern, who is a natural authority, who is admitted to the raza but only conditionally, and then is able to be rejected when circumstances or ideology render them disposable or surplus, et cetera, et cetera. So that's sort of where I see the pink tide, I think, kind of operating the most within this logic as a kind of decolonizing, as a sort of mental decolonization, a political decolonization, not a formal one, because obviously these are places that have not been colonies of Spain for 200 years, but a kind of decolonization of the mentality of like who can actually govern and for whom is the nation actually, by, of, and for whom. And that, I think, was a really radical challenge to the status quo and to the kind of racialized structure of class power in particularly South America, that I think doesn't get as much attention as it perhaps should, and is something that I will write about a little bit. But it is, you're tracing like legacies of legacies of legacies. So I don't want to make a causal argument about the Spanish Civil War per se, but I do think one of the things that the pink tide was litigating, as every Latin American socioeconomically reformist or revolutionary movement has litigated since the 19th century, is how do we break up the institutions that were bequeathed to us by the empire? How do we break up the arrangement of land tenure? How do we break up the church? How do we break the power of the military? Like, how do we reform these things and create different kinds of ways of being with each other, different ways of living well, right? Of defining political and social life. And so that, I think, is the kind of one of the ways in which the pink tide is more radical than it's often given credit for. To generalize about a bunch of governments that were actually like fairly different from each other and unfolded on different timescales and, et cetera.
So going in a way full circle, and also because of what you were saying about the pragmatic work of anti-fascism that is not necessarily called that, but that you see as probably the main and most important anti-fascist work that has been done, it seems that maybe the current situation would sort of flesh it out or bring it to the forth. And it would bring it to the forth not only because fascism or neo-fascism or whatever we call it, regardless of the outcome of the fascist debate, is resurgent. I mean, a far right with its Spanish roots, as far as South America is concerned, is resurgent. And what they give us, to a certain extent, is the fact that their new boogeyman, or one of their new boogeymen, is anti-fascism.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Yep.
Antifa, but anti-fascism altogether, which is interesting. So, yes, they speak about cultural Marxism and communism. Yes, of course, they speak about wokeism and all its derivatives, but anti-fascism is becoming prominent there. So in terms of the, espousing the stigmata and returning it, it seems to be like the right moment to do that. And it seems to me that the prism of the Spanish Civil War that your book brings forth is kind of a matrix for actually doing that.
Yeah, I think so. I think that, if like the return of anti-fascism is a kind of return of the repressed, right? Like the repression having occurred in the wake of the Second World War and being precisely one of the results, not accidentally, of sort of Cold War liberalism, right? Which is basically erasing the contributions of communists and socialists and anti-fascists to the work of having destroyed Hitlerism, basically, right? And so, the reclamation of anti-fascism as a kind of positioning is potentially very powerful and very promising. What it does is it sort of borrows a bit from that kind of coalitional practice of the right, which is to say, let's cohere around the enemy rather than endlessly dwell in our own divisions and fractions of, policy and this and that. And will that work? Like, could anti-fascism be once more the sort of kind of a unifying principle that ties together, if not a popular front as such, then I think in effect, right? And I think, I keep talking about Minneapolis, but I think that it is really important for understanding the potential of that, because it doesn't have to be called anti-fascism, and the people doing it don't have to say, I am an anti-fascist, to do anti-fascist work, to do obviously anti-fascist work, and to do it in ways that are unquestionably really effective. Right? Like within the kind of impoverished political landscape of US policy under Trump, it was the people's movement of the city of Minneapolis that was able to force the Trump administration to do some personnel shakeups in terms of who's running DHS, to, sort of chase ICE out of some of these communities by literally throwing their bodies upon the gears of fascist immigration enforcement. And so, I think for a lot of us that has been, on the one hand, obviously devastating in terms of the human cost to observe, but also very inspiring. And I think the challenge, certainly in the US context, which whatever, I live here, so that's the one I think about the most, is what kinds of work can be done under the current, within the confines of the current conjuncture, even if you, and perhaps especially if you happen to live in a community that has not yet been targeted for an invasive attack as Minneapolis was, or as Chicago to a somewhat lesser extent was, or as Lewiston, Maine was, right? Like, I feel like I know a lot of people who are trying to figure out, okay, what is the terrain between showing up to a No Kings rally, which have been really heavily attended by folks who I think would self-describe as centrists and liberals, right? What is the middle ground? What can I do that is useful between showing up to a rally, which obviously the current administration does not care about rallies or bad press or whatever. Like, that's not a mode of persuasion that really functions in terms of producing political change. And physically putting my body between a heavily armed, poorly trained, rank and file ICE agent and someone that they are trying to deport. What is in that middle space? And I really think that is the project right now for us, is to flesh out and create possibilities and opportunities to pull people in, to give folks places where they can put the frustration and the energy and the alienation and the rage and the heartbreak that I think so many people who live in the United States right now are feeling, and not obviously only in the United States, ways of channeling their energies. Because I think in many ways, and part of this is COVID and part of it is neoliberalism, like our associational life has been profoundly hollowed out, and we don't necessarily have places to put ourselves that are collective in ways that are, that look similar to what they might have looked like in the 30s and 40s or whatever. And so, how can we build in that space? That's something I think about a lot, and I don't know the answer, but I think that's the question.
It's the right question,
yes.
Yeah.
So finally,
yes.
And following this line here from the south to the north that we're kind of making, in a recent interview, you emphasized the family resemblances between Francoism and Trump, or Trumpism. Could you speak a little bit about why, in this case, you're reaching back to the Spanish Civil War yourself to understand some fascist tendencies in the present? Relatedly, if Trump has identified in US universities the hotbed of the anti-fascist enemy, so anti-racism, anti-Zionism, feminism, socialism, how and why do you think universities constitute one significant site for anti-fascist resistance? And in this light, could you talk about your specific case, perhaps, as a leading organizer with the AAUP in your lawsuit against the Trump administration?
Okay. So, I mean, the thing about Trumpism and Francoism, I think, goes back to something I was saying before about basically just that these are individuals in history who are very talented at right-wing coalitional politics. And that I think that's something that we on the left should study and should think about, actually, and take seriously, even as it is difficult to take seriously individuals who do not necessarily approach their own work of coalition building with the same seriousness that I think we should apply to it, certainly in the Trumpian case. But that really is a thing that is just striking to me, right? That like you can make the thing hold together in this way, and is there something to derive from looking at that phenomenon if you take out, can that kind of unity cohere absent reactionary nationalism, absent the kind of visceral pleasure of, the sort of sadistic, like, torment of the work of social exclusion, the, like, violence against immigrants, against people of color, against other marginalized sectors, whatever. Like, there is clearly a frisson of pleasure that the sort of hard MAGA base, like, gets off on with all this stuff. So, like, is that the thing that makes it all hold together? I don't know. I think we should figure it out. Right? Because if we were going to try to do that kind of, to hold together coalitions that, in which the left can actually participate meaningfully and not simply be taken for granted / brought along for the ride / jettisoned at the first opportunity by the liberals who then actually just want to make nice with the far right. Then I think it's worth figuring out, like, what is it that allows for these particular kinds of formations to have their, to maintain their unity in the way that they do. Vis-a-vis universities, I mean, one of the things that, folks have said a lot in the first year of the second Trump administration is that it's been astonishing to see how quickly institutions that should have, that have all of the material resources to claim and enact autonomy have actually capitulated in various ways, very quickly and very easily to the federal government's demands, whether that's the big law firms, whether that is universities like Columbia and Penn that did deals with the Trump administration early on, whether that's universities like my own, which have not formally done a deal but have quietly reconfigured a lot of things on campus in order to preemptively conform to the Trump administration's demands in the hope of being able to sign a deal eventually, which is where they are at right now. So I don't think universities themselves are sites or are necessarily anti-fascist formations. Universities are like big hospital industrials, certainly in the contemporary United States, like these are big landowners, these are big political operatives, these are hospital managers, these are any number of things that are not, gentle humanists sitting around writing anti-fascist tracts. Like, there are some of us in those universities who do that, but we're not we're not the majority, we're not the mainstream. Nevertheless, right, you always have to work with what you have. And, despite the dramatic, kind of winnowing to the point of evisceration of the protections of tenure and job security, et cetera, in US higher ed, there are still a few of us who have positions of real protection, right? Like, I technically can't be fired. I have tenure at a university that predates the founding of the United States and will probably postdate its dissolution, And so I can do some stuff within that, from that subject position, and therefore I think it is incumbent on me to do that stuff. And so some of that stuff has been organizing with the American Association of University Professors, which is a national organization that has really been on the barricades, at the forefront, fighting back against the Trump administration's assault on higher ed across the country in its various forms, whether that is repressing pro-Palestinian speech, whether that is funding cuts to science research, there's a whole, whether that's the anti-DEI set of impositions and rollbacks, that the AAUP is really, there's nobody else who is out there in the way that they are. And so a bunch of different local university chapters have been active in doing legislative work, litigation, traditional street protest, all, again, pulling out all the stops, whatever we can do to try and preserve what little piece of the university remains as a space for independent inquiry and critical investigation of our reality, right? But, I think that the hollowing out of higher ed in this country has been basically kind of bipartisan project for a long time. And Trump, again, classically is doing it in a characteristically grotesque and exaggerated fashion. But we can see the roots of this go back decades. And, if you think about the sort of like tradition of anti-intellectualism in US conservative thought back to the 19th century. So, is this new or not new? I don't know. I think authoritarians hate universities because they are places where we're supposed to be allowed to think, and they don't want that. And so we have to fight for the places, as imperfect and flawed and compromised as they inevitably are, in which the idea of these very simple practices like thinking and reading and arguing and critiquing continue to be possible. That is also anti-fascist work. I think, again, if not explicitly so, if not self-identifyingly so by all of the people who participate in it, it is in effect anti-fascist work. And therefore we have to keep doing it, even in circumstances that are not, where inspiration is kind of hard to come by. You just have to keep doing the work. So that's what we try to do.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. You guys are doing the work. This is the kind of conversation that, this is what it is. This is that work.
Let's hope so. We're trying.
Look at all the lovely people